The Hall of the Dead by Robert E. Howard. The gorge was dark, although the setting sun had left a band of orange and yellow and green along the western horizon. Against this band of color, a sharp eye could still discern in black silhouette the domes and spires of Shadizar the Wicked, the city of dark-haired women and towers of spider-haunted mystery, the capital of Zamora. As the twilight faded, the first few stars appeared overhead. As if answering a signal, lights winked on in the distant domes and spires. While the light of the stars was pale and wan, that of the windows of Shadizar was a sultry amber with a hint of abominable deeds. The gorge was quite safe for the chirping of nocturnal insects. Presently, however, this silence was broken by the sound of moving men. Up the gorge came a squad of Zamorian soldiers, 5 men in plain steel caps and leather jerkins, studded with bronze buttons, led by an officer in a polished bronze cuirass and a helmet with a towering horsehair crest. Their bronze-greaved legs swished through the long, lush grass that covered the floor of the gorge. Their harness creaked, and their weapons clanged and tinkled. 3 of them bore bows, and the other 2 pikes. Short swords hung at their sides, and bucklers were slung across their backs. The officer was armed with a long sword and a dagger. One of the soldiers muttered,
"If we, catch this Conan fellow alive, what will they do with him?
Send him to Yazoo to feed to the spider god, I'll warrant,"
said another.
"The question is, shall we be alive to collect that reward they promised us?"
"Not afraid of him, are you?"
said a third.
"Me?
The second speaker snorted.
I fear not, including death itself. The question is, whose death? This thief is not a civilized man, but a wild barbarian with the strength of 10. So I went to the magistrate to draw up my will."
"It is cheering to know that your heirs will get rewarded," said another. "I wish I had thought of that,"
Oh,
said the first man who had spoken.
they'll find some excuse to cheat us of the reward, even if we catch the rascal.
"The prefect himself has promised,"
said another.
"the rich merchants and nobles whom Conan has been robbing raised the fund. I saw the money, a bag so heavy with gold that a man could scarce lift it. After all that public display, they'd not dare to go back on their word."
"But suppose we catch him not?"
said the second speaker.
"There was something about paying for it with our heads."
The speaker raised his voice.
"Captain Nestor, what was that about our heads?"
"Hold your tongues, all of you," snapped the officer. "You can be heard as far as Aranjun. If Conan is within a mile, he'll be warned. Cease your chatter and try to move without so much clangor." The officer was a broad-shouldered man of medium height and powerful build. Daylight would have shown his eyes to be grey and his hair light brown, streaked with grey. He was a Gunderman from the northernmost province of Aquilonia, 1,500 miles to the west. His mission, to take Conan, dead or alive, troubled him. The prefect had warned him that, if he failed, he might expect severe punishment, perhaps even the headman's block. The king himself had demanded that the outlaw be taken, and the king of Zamora had a short way with servants who failed their missions. A tip from the underworld had revealed that Conan was seen heading for this gorge earlier that day, and Nestor's commander had hastily dispatched him with such troopers as could be found in the barracks. Nestor had no confidence in the soldiers that trailed behind him. He considered them braggarts who would flee in the face of danger, leaving him to confront a barbarian alone. And, although the gunderman was a brave man, he did not deceive himself about his chances with this ferocious, gigantic youth savage. His armor would give him no mere than a slight edge. As the glow in the western sky faded, the darkness deepened and the walls of the gorge became narrower, steeper, and rockier. Behind Nestor, the men began to murmur again.
I like it not. This road leads to the ruins of Larsha the Accursed, where the ghosts of the ancients lurk to devour passers-by. And in that city, 'tis said, lies the Hall of the Dead.
"Shut up!" snarled Nestor, turning his head. At that instant, the officer tripped over a rawhide rope stretched across the path and fell sprawling in the grass. There was the snap of a spring pole released from its lodgment, and the rope went slack. With a rumbling roar, a mass of rocks and dirt cascaded down the left-hand slope. As Nestor scrambled to his feet, a stone the size of a man's head struck his corselet and knocked him down again. Another knocked off his helmet, while smaller stones stung his limbs. Behind him sounded a multiple scream and the clatter of stones striking metal. Then, silence fell. Nestor staggered to his feet, coughed the dust out of his lungs, and turned to see what had befallen. A few paces behind him, a rock slide blocked the gorge from wall to wall. Approaching, he made out a human hand and a foot projecting from the rubble. He called, but received no reply. When he touched the protruding members, he found no life. The slide, set off by the pull on the rope, had wiped out his entire squad. Nestor flexed his joints to learn what harm he had suffered. No bones appeared to be broken, although his corselet was dented and he bore several bruises. Burning with wrath, he found his helmet and took up the trail alone. Failing to catch the thief would have been bad enough, but if he also had to confess to the loss of his men, he foresaw a lingering and painful death. His only chance now was to bring back Conan, or at least his head. Sword in hand, Nestor limped on up the endless windings of the gorge. A light in the sky before him showed that the moon, a little past full, was rising. He strained his eyes, expecting the barbarian to spring upon him from behind every bend in the ravine. The gorge became shallower, and the walls less steep. Gullies opened into the gorge to the right and left, while the bottom became stony and uneven, forcing Nestor to scramble over rocks and underbrush. At last the gorge gave out completely. Climbing in a short slope, the gunderman found himself on the edge of an upland plateau, surrounded by distant mountains. A bow shot ahead, bone-white in the light of the moon, rose the walls of Larsha. A massive gate stood directly in front of him. Time had bitten scallops out of the walls, and over it rose half-ruined roofs and towers. Nestor paused. Larsha was said to be immensely old. According to the tales, it went back to cataclysmic times even, when the forebears of the Zamorians, the Gemri, formed an island of semi-civilization in a sea of barbarism. Stories of the death that lurked in these ruins were rife in the bazaars of Shadizar. As far as Nestor had been able to learn, not one of the many men who, in historic times, had invaded the ruins searching for the treasure rumored to exist there, had ever returned. None knew what form the danger took, because no survivor had lived to carry the tale. A decade before, King Tiridates had sent a company of his bravest soldiers in broad daylight into the city, while the king himself waited outside the walls. There had been screams and sounds of flight, and then nothing. The men who waited outside had fled, and Tiridates perforce had fled with them. That was the last attempt to unlock the mystery of Larsa by main force. Although Nestor had all the usual mercenaries' lust for unearned wealth, he was not rash. Years of soldiering in the kingdoms between Zamora and his homeland had taught him caution. As he paused, weighing the danger of his alternatives, a sight made him stiffen. Close to the wall, he sighted the figure of a man slinking toward the gate. Although the man was too far away to recognize faces in the moonlight, there was no mistaking that panther-like stride. Conan. Filled with rising fury, Nestor started forward. He walked swiftly, holding his scabbard to keep it from clanking. But, quietly though he moved, the keen ears of the barbarian warned him. Conan whirled, and his sword whispered from its sheath. Then, seeing only a single foe pursued him, the Cimmerian stood his ground. As Nestor approached, he began to pick out details of the other's appearance. Conan was well over 6 feet tall, and his threadbare tunic failed to mask the hard lines of his mighty thews. A leathern sack hung by a strap from his shoulders. His face was youthful, but hard, surmounted by a square-cut mane of thick black hair. Not a word was spoken. Nestor paused to catch his breath and cast aside his cloak, and in that instant Conan hurled himself upon the older man. 2 swords glimmered like lightnings in the moonlight as the clang and rasp of blades shattered the graveyard silence. Nestor was the more experienced fighter, but the reach and blinding speed of the other nullified the disadvantage. Conan's attack was as elemental and irresistible as a hurricane. Parrying shrewdly, Nestor was forced back step after step. Narrowly, he watched his opponent, waiting for the other's attack to slow from sheer fatigue. But the Cimmerian seemed not to know what fatigue was. Making a backhand cut, Nestor slit Conan's tunic over the chest, but did not quite reach the skin. In a blinding return thrust, Conan's point glanced off Nestor's breastplate, plowing a groove in the bronze. As Nestor stepped back from another furious attack, a stone turned under his foot. Conan aimed a terrific cut at the Gunderman's neck. Had it gone as intended, Nestor's head would have flown from his shoulders. But, as he stumbled, the blow hit his crested helm instead. It struck with a heavy clang, bit into the iron, and hurled Nestor to the ground. Breathing deeply, Conan stepped forward, sword ready. His pursuer lay motionless with blood seeping from his cloven helmet. Youthful overconfidence in the force of his own blows convinced Conan that he had slain his antagonist. Sheathing his sword, he turned back toward the city of the ancients. The Cimmerian approached the gate. This consisted of 2 massive valves, twice as high as a man, made of foot-thick timbers sheathed in bronze. Conan pushed against the valves, grunting, but without effect. He drew his sword and struck the bronze with the pommel. From the way the gate sagged, Conan guessed that the wood of the doors had rotted away, but the bronze was too thick to hew through without spoiling the edge of his blade. And there was an easier way. 30 paces north of the gate, the wall had crumbled so that its lowest point was less than 20 feet above the ground. At the same time, a pile of tailings against the foot of the wall rose to within 6 or 8 feet of the broken edge. Conan approached the broken section, drew back a few paces, and then ran forward. He bounded up the slope of the tailings, leapt into the air, and caught the broken edge of the wall. A grunt, a heave, and a scramble, and he was over the edge, ignoring scratches and bruises. He stared down into the city. Inside the wall was a cleared space, where for centuries plant life had been waging war upon the ancient pavement. The paving slabs were cracked and upended. Between them, grass, weeds, and a few scrubby trees had forced their way. Beyond the cleared area lay the ruins of one of the poorer districts. Here, the one-story hovels of mud brick had slumped into mere mounds of dirt. Beyond them, white in the moonlight, Conan discerned the better preserved buildings of stone. The temples, the palaces, and the houses of the nobles and the rich merchants. As with many ancient ruins, an aura of evil hung over the deserted city. Straining his ears, Conan stared right and left. Nothing moved. The only sound was a chirp of crickets. Conan too had heard the tales of the doom that haunted Larsha. Although the supernatural roused panicky, atavistic fears in his barbarian soul, he hardened himself with the thought that when a supernatural being took material form, it could be hurt or killed by material weapons, just like any earthly man or monster. He had not come this far to be stopped from a try at a treasure by man, beast, or demon. According to the tales, the fabled treasure of Larsha lay in the royal palace. Gripping his scabbarded sword in his left hand, the young thief dropped from the inner side of the broken wall. An instant later, he was threading his way through the winding streets toward the center of the city. He made no more noise than a shadow. Ruin encompassed him on every side. Here and there, the front of a house had fallen into the street, forcing Conan to detour or to scramble over piles of broken brick and marble. The gibbous moon was now high in the sky, washing the ruins in an eerie light. On the Cimmerian's right rose a temple, partly fallen, but with the portico, upheld by 4 massive marble columns, still intact. Along the edge of the roof, a row of marble gargoyles peered down, statues of monsters of bygone days, half demon and half beast. Conan tried to remember the scraps of legend that he had overheard in the wine shops of the mall, concerning the abandonment of Larsha. There was something about a curse sent by an angered god many centuries before, in punishment for deeds so wicked that they made the crimes and vices of Shadizar look like virtues. He started for the center of the city again, but now noticed something peculiar. His sandals tended to stick to the shattered pavement, as if it were covered with warm pitch. The soles made sucking noises as he raised his feet. He stooped and felt the ground. It was coated with a film of a colorless, sticky substance, now nearly dry. Hand on hilt, Conan glared about him in the moonlight, but no sound came to his ears. He resumed his advance. Again, his sandals made sucking noises as he raised them. He halted, turning his head. He could have sworn that similar sucking noises came to his ears from a distance. For an instant, he thought they might be the echoes of his own footsteps. But he had passed a half-ruined temple, and now no walls rose on either side of him to reflect the sound. Again he advanced, then halted. Again he heard the sucking sound, and this time it did not cease when he froze to immobility. In fact, it became louder. His keen hearing located this as coming from directly in front of him. Since he could see nothing moving in the street before him, the source of the sound must be in a side street or in one of the ruined buildings. The sound increased to an indescribable, slithering, gurgling hiss. Even Conan's iron nerves were shaken by the strain of waiting for the unknown source of the sound to appear. At last, around the next corner poured a huge, slimy mass, leprous grey in the moonlight. It glided into the street before him and swiftly advanced upon him, silent save for the sucking sound of its peculiar method of locomotion. From its front end rose a pair of horn-like projections at least 10 feet long, with a shorter pair below. The long horns bent this way and that, and Conan saw that they bore eyes on their ends. The creature was, in fact, a slug. Like the harmless garden slug that leaves a trail of slime in its nightly wanderings. This slug, however, was 50 feet long and as thick through the middle as Conan was tall. Moreover, it moved as fast as a man could run. The fetid smell of the thing wafted ahead of it. Momentarily paralyzed with astonishment, Conan stared at the vast mass of rubbery flesh bearing down upon him. The slug emitted a sound like that of a man spitting, but magnified many times over. Galvanized into action at last, the Cimmerian leapt sideways. As he did so, a jet of liquid flashed through the night air just where he had stood. A tiny droplet struck his shoulder and burned like a coal of fire. Conan turned and ran back the way he had come, his long legs flashing in the moonlight. Again he had to bound over piles of broken masonry. His ears told him that the slug was close behind. Perhaps it was gaining. He dared not turn to look, lest he trip over some marble fragment and go sprawling. The monster would be upon him before he could regain his feet. Again came that spitting sound. Conan leapt frantically to one side. Again the jet of liquid flashed past him. Even if he kept ahead of the slug, all the way to the city wall, the next shot would probably hit its mark. Conan dodged around a corner to put obstacles between himself and the slug. He raced down a narrow zigzag street, then around another corner. He was lost in the maze of streets he knew, but the main thing was to keep turning corners so as not to give his pursuer another clear shot at him. The sucking sounds and the stench indicated that it was following his trail. Once when he paused to catch his breath, he looked back to see the slug pouring around the last corner he had turned. On and on he went, dodging this way and that through the maze of the ancient city. If he could not outrun the slug, perhaps he could tire it. A man he knew could outlast almost any animal in a long-distance run. But the slug seemed tireless. Something about the buildings he was passing now struck him as familiar. Then he realized that he was coming to the half-ruined temple he had passed just before he met the slug. A quick glance showed him that the upper parts of the building could be reached by an active climber. Conan bounded up a pile of rubbish to the top of the broken wall. Leaping from stone to stone, he made his way up the jagged profile of the wall to an unruined section facing the street. He found himself on a stretch of roof behind a row of marble gargoyles. He approached them, treading softly lest the half-ruined roof collapse beneath him, and detouring around holes through which a man could fall into the chambers below. The sound and smell of the slug came to him from the street. Realizing that it had lost his track, and uncertain as to which way to turn, the creature had evidently stopped in front of the temple. Very cautiously, for he was sure the slug could see him in the moonlight, Conan peered past one of the statues and down into the street. There lay the great, greyish mass on which the moon shone moistly. The eye stalks wavered this way and that, seeking the creature's prey. Beneath them, the shorter horns swept back and forth a little above the ground, as if smelling for the Cimmerian's trail. Conan felt certain that the slug would soon pick up his trail. He had no doubt that it could slither up the sides of the buildings quite as readily as he had climbed it. He put a hand against a gargoyle, a nightmarish statue with a humanoid body, bat's wings, and a reptilian head, and pushed. The statue rocked a trifle with a faint, crunching noise. At that sound, the horns of the slug whipped upward toward the roof of the temple. The slug's head came around, bending its body into a sharp curve. The head approached the front of the temple and began to slide up one of the huge pillars, directly below the place where Conan crouched with bared teeth. A sword, Conan thought, would be of little use against such a monstrosity. Like other lowly forms of life, it could survive damage that would instantly destroy a higher creature. Up the pillar came the slug's head, the eyes on their stalks swiveling back and forth. At the present rate, the monster's head would reach the edge of the roof, while most of its body still lay in the street below. Then Conan saw what he must do. He hurled himself at the gargoyle. With a mighty heave, he sent it tumbling over the edge of the roof. Instead of the crash that such a mass of marble would ordinarily make on striking the pavement, there floated up the sound of a moist, squashy impact, followed by a heavy thud as the forward part of the slug's body fell back to earth. When Conan risked a glance over the parapet, he saw that the statue had sunk into the slug's body until it was almost buried. The great grey mass writhed and lashed like a worm on a fisherman's hook. A blow of the tail made the front of the temple tremble. Somewhere in the interior, a few loose stones fell clattering. Conan wondered if the whole structure were about to collapse beneath him, burying him in the debris. "So much for you," snarled the Cimmerian. He went along the row of gargoyles until he found another that was loose, and directly over part of the slug's body. Down it went with another squashing impact. A third missed and shattered on the pavement. A fourth and smaller statue he picked bodily up and, muscles cracking with the strain, hurled outward so that it fell on the writhing head. As the beast's convulsions slowly subsided, Conan pushed over 2 more gargoyles to make sure. When the body no longer writhed, he clambered down the street. He approached the great stinking mass cautiously, sword out. At last, summoning all his courage, he slashed into the rubbery flesh. Dark ichor oozed out, and rippling morions ran through the wet, grey skin. But even though parts might retain signs of independent life, the slug as a whole was dead. Conan was still slashing furiously when a voice made him whirl about. It said, "I've got you this time." It was Nestor, approaching sword in hand, with a blood-stained bandage around his head, in place of his helmet. The gunderman stopped at the side of the slug. "Mitra, what is this?" "It is the spook of Larsha," said Conan, speaking Zamorian with a barbarous accent. "It chased me over half the city before I slew it." As Nestor stared incredulously, the Cimmerian continued. "What do you hear? How many times must I kill you before you stay dead?" "You shall see how dead I am," grated Nestor, bringing his sword up to guard. "What happened to your soldiers?" "Dead in that rock slide you rigged. As soon you shall be." "Look, you fool," said Conan. "Why waste your strength on sword strokes when there's more wealth here than the pair of us can carry away? If the tales are true, you are a good man of your hands. Why not join me to raid the treasure of Larsha instead?" "I must do the duty and avenge my men." "Defend yourself, dog of a barbarian." "By Crom, I'll fight if you like," growled Conan, bringing up his sword. "But think, man, if you go back to Shadazar, they'll crucify you for losing your command, even if you took my head with you, which I do not think you can do. If 1/10 of the stories are true, you'll get more from your share of the loot than you'd earn in 100 years as a mercenary captain." Nestor had lowered his blade and stepped back. Now he stood mute, thinking deeply. Conan added, "Besides, you'll never make real warriors of these poltroons of Zamorians." The gunderman sighed and sheathed his sword. "You are right, damn you. Until this venture is over, we'll fight back to back and go equal shares on the loot, eh?" He held out his hand. "Done," said Conan, sheathing likewise and clasping the other's hand. "If we have to run for it and get separated, let's meet at the fountains of Ninus." The royal palace of Larsha stood in the center of the city, in the midst of a broad plaza. It was the one structure that had not crumbled with age, and this for a simple reason. It was carved out of a single crag or hillock of rock that once broke the flatness of the plateau on which Larsha stood. So meticulous had been the construction of this building, however, that close inspection was needed to show that it was not an ordinary composite structures. Lines engraved in the black, basaltic surface imitated the joints between building stones. Treading softly, Conan and Nestor peered into the dark interior. "We shall need light," said Nestor. "I do not care to walk into another slug like that in the dark." "I don't smell another slug," said Conan, "but the treasure might have another guardian." He turned back and hewed down a pine sapling that thrust up through the broken pavement. Then he lopped its limbs and cut it into shorter lengths. Whittling a pile of shavings with his sword, he started a small fire with flint and steel. He split the ends of 2 of the billets until they were frayed out and then ignited them. The resinous wood burned vigorously. He handed one torch to Nestor, and each of them thrust half the spare billets through his girdle. And then, swords out, they again approached the palace. Inside the archway, the flickering yellow flames of the torches were reflected from polished walls of black stone, but underfoot the dust lay inches thick. Several bats, hanging from bits of stone carving overhead, squeaked angrily and whirred away into deeper darkness. They passed between statues of a horrific aspect, set in niches on either side. Dark hallways opened on either hand. They crossed a throne room. The throne, carved of the same black stone as the rest of the building, still stood. Other chairs and divans, being made of wood, had crumbled into dust, leaving a litter of nails, metallic ornaments, and semi-precious stones on the floor. "It must have stood vacant for thousands of years," whispered Nestor. They traversed several chambers, which might have been a king's private apartments, but the absence of perishable furnishings made it impossible to tell. They found themselves before a door. Conan put his torch close to it. It was a stout door, set in an arch of stone and made of massive timbers, bound together with brackets of green filmed copper. Conan poked the door with his sword. The blade entered easily. A little shower of dusty fragments, pale in the torchlight, sifted down. "It's rotten," growled Nestor, kicking out. His boot went into the wood almost as easily as Conan's sword had done. A copper fitting fell to the floor with a dull clank. In a moment, they had battered down the rotten timbers in a shower of wood dust. They stooped, thrusting their torches ahead of them into the opening. Light, reflected from silver, gold and jewels, winked back at them. Nestor pushed through the opening, then backed out so suddenly that he bumped into Conan. "There are men in there," he hissed. "Let's see." Conan thrust his head into the opening and peered right and left. "They're dead. Come on." Inside, they stared about them until their torches burned down to their hands, and they had to light a new pair. Around the room, 7 giant warriors, each at least 7 feet tall, sprawled in chairs. Their heads lay against the chair backs and their mouths hung open. They wore the trappings of a bygone era. Their plumed copper helmets and the copper scales on their corselets were green with age. Their skins were brown and waxy looking, like those of mummies, and grizzled beards hung down to their waists. Copper-bladed bills and pikes leaned against the wall beside them or lay on the floor. In the center of the room rose an altar, of black basalt like the rest of the palace. Near the altar, on the floor, several chests of treasure had lain. The wood of these chests had rotted away. The chests had burst open, letting a glittering drift of treasure pour out on the floor. Conan stepped close to one of the immobile warriors and touched the man's leg with the point of his sword. The body lay still. He murmured, "The ancients must have mummified them, as they tell me the priests do with the dead in Stygia." Nestor looked uneasily at the 7 still forms. The feeble flames of the torches seemed unable to push the dense darkness back to the sable walls and roof of the chamber. The block of black stone in the middle of the room rose to waist height. On its flat, polished top, inlaid in narrow strips of ivory, was a diagram of interlaced circles and triangles. The whole formed a 7-pointed star. The spaces between the lines were marked by symbols in some form of writing that Conan did not recognize. He could read Zamorian and write it after a fashion, and he had smatterings of Hyrcanian and Corinthian. But these cryptic glyphs were beyond him. In any case, he was more interested in the things that lay on top of the altar. On each point of the star, winking in the ruddy, wavering light of the torches, lay a great green jewel larger than a hen's egg. At the center of the diagram stood a green statuette of a serpent with upreared head, apparently carved from jade. Conan moved his torch close to the 7 great glowing gems. "I want those," he grunted. "You can have the rest." "No, you don't," snapped Nestor. "Those are worth more than all the other treasure in this room put together. I will have them." Tension crackled between the two men, and their free hands stole toward their hilts. For a space they stood silently, glaring at each other. Then Nestor said, "Then let us divide them as we agreed to do." "You cannot divide 7 by 2, said Conan. "Let us flip one of these coins for them. The winner takes the 7 jewels, while the other man has his pick of the rest. Does that suit you?" Conan picked a coin out of one of the heaps that marked the places where the chests had lain. Although he had acquired a good working knowledge of coins in his career as a thief, this was entirely unfamiliar. One side bore a face, but whether of a man, a demon, or an owl, he could not tell. The other side was covered with symbols like those on the altar. Conan showed the coin to Nestor. The 2 treasure hunters grunted agreement. Conan flipped the coin into the air, caught it, and slapped it down on his left wrist. He extended the wrist with the coin still covered toward Nestor. "Heads," said the Gunderman. Conan removed his hand from the coin. Nestor peered and growled, "Ishtar curse the thing. You win. Hold my torch for a moment." Conan, alert for any treacherous move, took the torch. But Nestor merely untied the strap of his cloak and spread the garment on the dusty floor. He began shoveling handfuls of gold and gems from the heaps of the floor into a pile on the cloak. "Don't load yourself so heavy that you can't run," said Conan. "We are not out of this yet, and it's a long walk back to Shadizar." "I can handle it," said Nestor. He gathered up the corners of the cloak, slung the improvised bag over his back, and held out a hand for his torch. Conan handed it to him and stepped to the altar. One by one he took the great green jewels and thrust them into the leathern sack that hung from his shoulders. When all 7 had been removed from the altar top, he paused, looking at the jade serpent. "This will fetch a pretty price," he said. Snatching it up, he thrust it too into his booty bag. "Why not take some of the remaining gold and jewels too?" asked Nestor. "I have all I can carry." "You've got the best stuff," said Conan. "Besides, I don't need any more. Man, with these I can buy a kingdom, or a dukedom anyway, and all the wine I can drink and women I..." A sound caused the plunderers to whirl, staring wildly. Around the walls, the 7 mummified warriors were coming to life. Their heads came up, their mouths closed, and air hissed into their ancient, withered lungs. Their joints creaked like rusty hinges as they picked up their pikes and bills and rose to their feet. "Run!" yelled Nestor, hurling his torch at the nearest giant and snatching out his sword. The torch struck the giant in the chest, fell to the floor, and went out. Having both hands free, Conan retained his torch while he drew his sword. The light of the remaining torch flickered feebly on the green of the ancient copper harness as the giants closed in on the pair. Conan ducked the sweep of a bill and knocked the thrust of a pike aside. Between him and the door, Nestor engaged the giant who was moving to block their escape. The gunderman parried a thrust and struck a fierce, backhanded blow at his enemy's thigh. The blade bit, but only a little way. It was like chopping wood. The giant staggered, and Nestor hewed at another. The point of a pike glanced off his dented cuirass. The giants moved slowly, or the treasure hunters would have fallen before their first onset. Leaping, dodging and whirling, Conan avoided blows that would have stretched him senseless on the dusty floor. Again and again his blade bit into the dry, woody flesh of his assailants. Blows that would have decapitated a living man only staggered these creatures from another age. He landed a chop on the hand of one attacker, maiming the member and causing the giant to drop his pike. He dodged the thrust of another pike and put every ounce of strength into a low forehand cut at the giant's ankle. The blade bit half through, and the giant crashed to the floor. "Out!" bellowed Conan, leaping over the fallen body. He and Nestor raced out the door and through halls and chambers. For an instant Conan feared they were lost, but he caught a glimpse of light ahead. The two dashed out the main portal of the palace. Behind them came the clatter and tramp of the guardians. Overhead, the sky had paled and the stars were going out with the coming of dawn. "Head for the wall!" panted Nestor. "I think we can outrun them." As they reached the far side of the plaza, Conan glanced back. "Look!" he cried. One by one, the giants emerged from the palace. And one by one, as they came into the growing light, they sank to the pavement and crumbled into dust, leaving their plumed copper helmets, their scaled cuirasses, and their other accoutrements in heaps on the ground. "Well, that's that," said Nestor. "But how shall we get back into Shadowzar without being arrested? It will be daylight long before we get there." Conan grinned. "There's a way of getting in that we thieves know. Near the northeast corner of the wall stands a clump of trees. If you poke around among the shrubs that mask the wall, you will find kind of culvert. I suppose to let the water out of the city in heavy rains. It used to be closed by an iron grating, but that has rusted away. If you're not too fat, you can worm your way through it. You come out in a lot where people dump rubbish from houses that have been torn down." "Good," said Nestor. A deep rumble cut off his words. The earth heaved and rocked and trembled, throwing him to the ground and staggering the Cimmerian. "Look out!" yelled Conan. As Nestor started to scramble up, Conan caught his arm and dragged him back toward the center of the plaza. As he did so, the wall of a nearby building fell over into the plaza. It smashed down just where the two had been standing, but its mighty crash was lost in the thunder of the earthquake. "Let's get out of here," shouted Nestor. Steering by the moon, now low in the western sky, they ran zigzag through the streets. On either sides of them, walls and columns leaned, crumbled and crashed. The noise was deafening. Clouds of dust arose, making the fugitives cough. Conan skidded to a halt and leapt back to avoid being crushed under the front of a collapsing temple. He staggered as fresh tremors shook the earth beneath him. He scrambled over piles of ruin, some old and some freshly made. He leapt madly out from under a falling column drum. Fragments of stone and brick struck him. One laid open a cut along his jaw. Another glanced from his shin, making him curse by the gods of all the lands he had visited. At last he reached the city wall. It was a wall no longer, having been shaken down to a low ridge of broken stone. Limping, coughing and panting, Conan climbed the ridge and turned to look back. Nestor was no longer with him. Probably, he thought, the gunderman had been caught under a falling wall. Conan listened, but could hear no cry for help. The rumble of quaking earth and fallen masonry died away. The light of the low moon glistened on the vast cloud of dust that covered the city. Then a dawn breeze sprang up and slowly wafted the dust away. Sitting on the crest of the ridge of ruin that marked the site of the wall, Conan stared back across the site of Lasha. The city bore an aspect entirely different from when he had entered it. Not a single building remained upright. Even the monolithic palace of black basalt where he and Nestor had found their treasure had crumbled into a heap of broken blocks. Conan gave up thoughts of going back to the palace on some future occasion to collect the rest of the treasure. An army of workmen would have to clear away the wreckage before the valuables could be salvaged. All of Lasha had fallen into heaps of rubble. As far as he could see in the growing light, nothing moved in the city. The only sound was the belated fall of an occasional stone. Conan felt his booty bag to make sure that he still had his loot and turned his face westward, towards Shadazar. Behind him, the rising sun shot a spear of light against his broad back. The following night, Conan swaggered into his favorite tavern, that of Abelides in the mall. The low, smoke-stained room stank of sweat and sour wine. At crowded tables, thieves and murderers drank ale and wine, diced, argued, sang, quarreled, and blustered. It was deemed a dull evening here when at least one customer was not stabbed in a brawl. Across the room, Conan sighted his sweetheart of the moment, drinking alone at a small table. This was Semiramis, a strongly built, black-haired woman several years older than the Cimmerian. "Oh there, Semiramis," roared Conan, pushing his way across. "I've got something to show you. Abelides, a jug of your best Kyrian. I'm in luck tonight." Had Conan been older, caution would have stopped him from openly boasting of his plunder, let alone displaying it. As it was, he strode up to Semiramis' table and upended the leathern sack containing the 7 great green gems. The jewels cascaded out of the bag, thumped the wine-wet tabletop, and crumbled instantly into fine green powder, which sparkled in the candlelight. Conan dropped the sack and stood with his mouth agape, while nearby drinkers burst into raucous laughter. "Crom-em-em-nanan," the Cimmerian breathed at last. "This time, it seems, I was too clever for my own good." Then he bethought him of the jade serpent still in the bag. "Well, I have something that will pay for a few good carousals anyway." Moved by curiosity, Semiramis picked up the sack from the table. Then she dropped it with a scream.
It's alive!
She cried. What? Began Conan, but a shout from the doorway cut him off.
Darius! Men, seize him!
A fat magistrate had entered the tavern, followed by a squad of the night watch, armed with bills. The other customers fell silent, staring woodenly into the space as if they knew nothing of Conan or of any of the other riffraff who were Abuliti's guests. The magistrate pushed towards Conan's table. Whipping out his sword, the Cimmerian put his back against the wall. His blue eyes blazed dangerously, and his teeth showed him in the candlelight. "Take me if you can, dogs," he snarled. "I've done nothing against your stupid laws." Out of the side of his mouth, he muttered to Semiramis, "Grab the bag and get out of here. If they get me, it's yours."
I'm afraid of it.
Whimpered the woman.
Oh-ho!
Chortled the magistrate, coming forward.
Nothing, eh? Nothing but to rob our leading citizens blind. There's evidence enough to lop your head off 100 times over. And then you slew Nestor's soldiers and persuaded him to join you in a raid on the ruins of Larsha, eh? We found him earlier this evening, drunk and boasting of his feat. The villain got away from us, but you shan't.
As the watchman formed a half circle around Conan, bills pointing towards his breast, the magistrate noticed the sack on the table.
What's this? Your latest loot? We'll see.
The fat man thrust a hand into the sack. For an instant, he fumbled. Then his eyes widened. His mouth opened to emit an appalling shriek. He jerked his hand out of the bag. A jade green snake, alive and writhing, had thrown a loop around his wrist and had sunk its fangs into his hand. Cries of horror and amazement rose. A watchman sprang back and fell over a table, smashing mugs and splashing liquors. Another stepped forward to catch the magistrate as he tottered and fell. A third dropped his bill and, screaming hysterically, broke for the door. Panic seized the customers. Some jammed themselves into the door, struggling to get out. A couple started fighting with knives, while another thief, locked in combat with a watchman, rolled over the floor. One of the candles was knocked over, then another, leaving the room but dimly lit by the little earthenware lamp over the counter. In the gloom, Conan caught Semiramis' wrist and hauled her to her feet. He beat the panic-stricken mob aside with the flat of his sword and forced his way through the throng to the door. Out in the night, the two ran, rounding several corners to throw off pursuit. Then they stopped to breathe. Conan said, "The city will be too cursed hot for me after this. I'm on my way. Goodbye, Semiramis."
Would you not care to spend the last night with me?
"Not this time. I must try to catch that rascal Nestor. If the fool hadn't blabbed, the law would not have gotten on my trail so quickly. He has all the treasure a man can carry, while I ended up with naught. Maybe I can persuade him to give me half. If not," he thumbed the edge of his sword. Semiramis sighed.
There will always be a hideout for you in Shadazar while I live. Give me a last kiss.
They embraced briefly. Then Conan was gone, like a shadow in the night. On the Corinthian road that leads west from Shadazar, 3 bowshots from the city walls, stands the fountain of Ninus. According to the story, Ninus was a rich merchant who suffered from a wasting disease. A god visited him in his dreams and promised him a cure if he would build a fountain on the road leading to Shadizar from the west, so that travelers could wash and quench their thirst before entering the city. Ninus built that fountain, but the tale does not tell whether he recovered from his sickness. Half an hour after his escape from Abulites' tavern, Conan found Nestor sitting on the curbing of Ninus' fountain. "How did you make it out with your 7 matchless gems?" asked Nestor. Conan told what had befallen his share of the loot. "Now," he said, "since, thanks to your loose tongue, I must leave Shadizar, and since I have none of the treasure left, it would be only right for you to divide your remaining portion with me." Nestor gave a barking, mirthless laugh. "My share? Boy, here is half of what I have left." From his girdle he brought out 2 pieces of gold and tossed one to Conan, who caught it. "I owe it to you for pulling me away from that falling wall." "What happened to you?" "When the watch cornered me in the dive, I managed to cast a table and bowl a few over. Then I picked up the bright stuff in my cloak, slung it over my back, and started for the door. One who tried to halt me I cut down, but another landed a slash on my cloak. Next thing I knew, the whole mass of gold and jewels spilled out on the floor, and everybody, watchmen, magistrate, and customers, joined in a mad scramble for them." He held up the cloak, showing a 2-foot rent in the fabric. "Thinking that the treasure would do me no good if my head were adorning a spike over the west gate, I left while the leaving was good. When I got outside the city, I looked in my mantle, but all I found were those 2 coins, caught in a fold. You're welcome to one of them." Conan stood scowling for a moment. Then his mouth twitched into a grin. A low laugh rumbled in his throat. His head went back as he burst into a thunderous guffaw. "A fine pair of treasure seekers we are. Crom! But the gods have had sport with us. What a joke!" Nestor smiled wryly. "I'm glad you see the amusing side of it, but after this I do not think Shadizar will be safe for either of us." "Whither are you bound?" asked Conan. "I'll head east to seek a mercenary post in Tehran. They say King Yildiz is hiring fighters to whip his raggle-taggle horde into a real army. Why not come with me, lad? You're cut out for a soldier." Conan shook his head. "Not for me. Marching back and forth on the drill ground all day while some fat-headed officer bawls, 'Forward, march, present pikes.' I hear there are good pickings in the west. I'll try that for a while." "Well, may your barbarous gods go with you," said Nestor. "If you change your mind, ask for me in the barracks of Akrapur. Farewell." "Farewell," replied Conan. Without further words, he stepped out on the Corinthian road, and soon was lost to view in the night.